boundary is crossed? How do we allocate the environmental flows to one system or the other? Now that's quite technical, but let me give you a few examples. Now the biggest examples we see in LCA for pavement is where we come into a situation that we call a multi-output situation. It's when there's a production unit or part of the life cycle where there's more than one product being produced. Now, how do you allocate what went into making those products to the dedicated specific individual products? Another example that's very relevant to pavement LCA is the use and production and recovery of recycled material. New pavement can use these recycled materials. Pavement that is being maintained or reconstructed will produce a lot of these materials. And how do we do the accounting between one pavement system and the other pavement system? And the third example that you see in every LCA, which is much relevant for pavement LCA, is when there's a situation of multiple inflows going into one process. For example, a landfill where all kinds of material are being combined, but there's just one set of emissions coming out of that landfill. How do we assign those emissions then to the inflows that go in there? That's mostly to do with end-of-life considerations, which are less relevant for pavement LCA. Now let's give me an example of each, the two most important ones. And the first one being multi-output LCA, when there is multiple products coming from production unit. ISO tells us that we need to look at trying to match as closely as possible the physical properties of the outgoing flows. That could be mass, that could be economic value, that could be energy content. If you apply that to, for example, a refinery where binder is being produced for asphalt, that refinery is complex, several steps. There's a certain amount of crude oil that's going in, and there's a pretty large portfolio of products coming out. And how do we know which parts of the processing at the refinery level, the upstream for the crude oil production, needs to be assigned to the asphalt binder, and how much needs to be assigned to some of the fuels, the gasoline, for example, that we all drive on? LCA tells you to look at what works best. And there have been LCA studies looking at all three of these: mass, economic value, and energy content. So it's important to know what it is, and it's important to be clear about how to apply that. Another example where you know it's clearly wrong to do one or the other is, for example, the use of blast furnace slag in cement to substitute clinker. If you look at it from this perspective of a steel mill, the steel mill makes steel, and there's an amount of blast furnace slag coming out. If you were to allocate the steel mill based on mass, a lot of the environmental impacts would go to the blast furnace slag, and we all know that that's the byproduct that has a much lower economic value. And so then the question is, well, shouldn't economic value be a better description of why we're actually doing this and why this is being produced than just the mere use of mass? Now, in some cases, it's hard to establish this relationship, and what ISO then says, well, let's start with mass and then continue going forward and perform sensitivity analysis on different options. Second example of allocation, which is relevant to LCA, is how we apply allocation to the use and production of recycled materials. For example, supplementary cementitious material, but this could also be wrap going into new asphalt pavement. So this applies to all the materials that we see and use in pavement, and it's the material we also see used more and more when we discuss sustainable pavement. There are different ways of allocation. I just want to go over one. It's the most conservative approach, and it's being used in the application of environmental product declaration, where it says, well, let's keep it as simple and as close to what we know for today. And what they're basically saying, if you produce recycled material, say you do a reconstruction of a pavement, then the pavement is being demolished, and it gets to maybe a temporary storage on site. all the handling should go to the pavement that's being deconstructed. But then at the same time that material is being used in the next pavement, and for that it needs to be transported, and maybe it needs to be crushed or sifted, and all that handling goes to the next pavement. These are just two examples of how allocation can be applied in LCA. Some of these definitions are contentious. What typically gets done around allocation is that however you set it up, the idea is that you want to incentivize reduced environmental impact. We're trying to do something good. By creating these rules, we need to make sure that we prevent double counting, and at the same time don't leave things out, so the mass balances need to close. It should provide fairness between industries by reflecting as closely as possible what's actually happening, and be transparent so that all parties can understand how it is applied and how it influences results. And due to the sensitivity of some of these choices, ISO actually mandates that you perform a sensitivity analysis during the interpretation stage of your LCA. Under the Sustainable Pavement Program, we're developing different tools for you, for different DOTs and people that are interested in sustainability of pavement and sustainable pavement. And one of the tech briefs that has been developed and is available on the hub, you see the URL at the left bottom of the slide. One of the tech briefs goes into life cycle assessment. And if you want to have a short introduction into the origin, principles, and purpose of LCA, the standards that apply, how we look at life cycle phases from the pavement, how LCA is under development and how it's moving forward, some examples of how you can apply life cycle thinking, and then this would be a good place to start. The second output from the program is that we're working on a pavement LCA framework. There is no standard for pavement LCA, and so what we're trying to establish is a guidance book, a framework for performing life cycle assessment specific to pavement, with guidance on the overall approach and methodology, as well as on the system boundaries. And so you can see that as an information document that captures the best practice that we see for conducting a pavement LCA, but it's not a FHWA policy or mandate. Now, we hope that that's going to be a tremendous resource to the industry. It's based on the best standards around. Life cycle assessment is governed by the ISO 14040 series, the International Standardization Organization, and the standards under development in Europe, the EN 15804, specifically dedicated to environmental product declarations. Now, ISO is an organization that governs international standards. Standardization organizations in America, like ASTM, are a member of ISO. The ISO 14000 series governs environment, and the subsection, the 14040 series, governs life cycle assessment. Just to give you a little background on the term ISO. It's also based, the framework is also based on the learnings and the current status for pavement life cycle assessment from literature review. We've compiled a really big document on basically worldwide pavement LCA literature to see how people deal with topics, what are the key issues, and some of them we've presented here today. And that feeds into the framework. And at the same time, there is some guidance already developed. For example, there's a checklist on UC Davis on how to report and how to make it a complete LCA report when you're done performing the LCA. So we're building on existing experience, and we're trying to make it as standardized and comprehensive as possible. If we look at the table of contents of that document that is under development, it follows the life cycle assessment stages. So we go from a goal and scope, why are we doing the LCA, what are we trying to learn? to the inventory section, what data do we need to be able to answer those questions. As Alyssa said, that leads to a very long list of different impacts, and what we're trying to do is make those more communicable by using impact assessment, so we can talk about the impacts on climate change, acidification, the list that Alyssa showed you before. We're going to give you some guidance and help on how to look at those results, what can be learned from them, when do you need to do sensitivity analysis, how can we test the key assumptions that went into deriving the results. The next section is then on reporting. How do you actually write up a complete LCA report that if somebody else reads it, that they understand what has been done. And the last section is about critical review. What are the rules that would apply from a standardization perspective, and what guidance can we give the industry going forward? And this becomes especially critical when you talk about comparative LCA, when you're comparing different designs, and especially when you make those available for communication to the public, and you're going to make public statements. And so that's an important section on once we've done all the homework and we've done the proper interpretation, what I'm going to use the results for, and how much due diligence do we need to put into place to be able to communicate those results. Now, the timeline that we have here is that we are taking 5 steps. The last one, the actual delivery of the framework document. And as you see here in the slide is that we already have completed several steps. There's a first draft available that is being shared with people involved in the Sustainable Pavement Technical Working Group as part of this project. We're gathering feedback, and based on the feedback, we will develop a second draft, and we will hope to publish the framework in September of 2015. And so if you're interested in hearing more about this, then feel free to reach out to Kurt, who's heading up this project. I'd like to switch topics a little bit. We've heard about lifecycle cost assessment analysis. We've heard about the rating systems. We've heard about lifecycle assessment. And I want to spend a few minutes on how these methods are actually being used and where we hope they're going to be adopted more and more going forward. There are more of these assessment methods, but these are the 3 predominant ones. And what we see happening is that different agencies are starting to work or implementing these assessment methods by choice because they want to learn from them and recognize the benefit. And the adoption of these systems is different for different agencies, and these different assessment methods are also in different stages of how many people are actually using them. What we see is that they can be used together, and so one recommendation could be that if you're applying life cycle cost analysis right now, and you've never done life cycle assessment or rating system, the typical experience is if you do them together, you learn more. That doesn't mean you have to use them all in concert, but you can. So they can be used alone, but they can also be used in concert. And if you take a close look at the rating systems, there are actually many rating systems that have points in the point structure, as Steve pointed out. And some of those points are actually attributed to, are you using life cycle cost analysis, or are you using life cycle assessment? Now, if you use them in concert, Steve said sustainability covers a broad range of topics. In a way, you could say it's everything. If you only look at the economic side, LCCA, or if you only look at the environmental side, life cycle assessment, if you use them together, you get a more holistic assessment. And rating systems try to do that the most, although they're usually more qualitative and less quantitative. Now, if you look at how different agencies or owners or VOCs are using this, it comes down, and Steve mentioned that as already, what aspects and elements of sustainability do you want to give priority, and which ones do you want to work on? And based on those priorities, you make a selection of which instruments suit that purpose best, and then see whether you need to use all of them or one of them, and start to apply them and see what you can learn from it. Now, there are different examples. Lots of DOTs are already working on looking at lowest lifecycle cost solutions, using LCCA in the pavement type selection process, using LCCA during the early design process to optimize for cost. A lot of information, and that's the beauty of what goes into an LCCA, can be recycled in a life cycle assessment. If you're collecting the cost data for pay items and materials and processes for the life cycle of the pavement, that's information you also need for life cycle assessment. It's just that the language and indicators that go with it are different. It's not dollars, it's emissions, it's resource usage, and in the end expressed in the impact assessment category that Alyssa talked about. Different, for example, the Illinois Tollway is using both the LCCA and the LCA. And they're also developing a rating system where those three things come together. And so a strategic DOT could choose to integrate them all and get to applying a rating system that pays tribute to using the LCCA and LCA to get to a broad view of sustainability. One thing to point out, and I think it's important, is that these assessment tools can be used on different levels. And when I talk about level, I talk about the use on agency level, the use on a network or pavement system level, and the use on a pavement project level. And so any LCA starts with, well, why are we doing this LCA? And one of those questions to address is, well, what do we want to learn from this? Is this a pavement-specific project LCA or sustainability assessment? Is it something we want to learn on the broad stroke practices that we have implemented over our entire system, or is there something about how the agency actually operates? And it's important to know that these assessment methods can be used and tailored to address these different goals. And to put that in a graph, maybe there's too much information in here, but what we try to do is to look at, well, if you look at, for example, life cycle assessment, which is environmental performance, and you see it here in green. This can be used to look at project goals. It could be used to look at a system or a network goal, and more generally on some environmental priorities on the agency level. And the same applies to the LCCA. So depending on how you want to start, which questions you want to address, where you want to focus on sustainability, these tools can be used on different levels, and you would use these tools differently. And in general, you can say that rating systems can be used on all these levels. And when you apply INVEST rating system, you see that there are different points and questions and sustainability criteria on all three levels. Now, talking about how standardized this landscape, it's a fairly new landscape. The most widely used, and Steve said it, the standard for LCCA is over 17, about 20 years old. It's most mature, and most DOTs are actually using them in some form or fashion. Life cycle assessment is being used by some agencies, usually on a project basis, sometimes on a network basis. But as Alyssa pointed out, there are several things that still need to be fleshed out. And that's why it's so important that we're developing an initial version of the pavement LCA framework, aiming to providing guidance specific to the pavement industry. And I will hope that that framework is going to be used going forward, and that we can all learn from applying it so we can get to a better version the next time around. Now, rating systems are relatively new. They're also not subject to a standard. If you look at the ones that Steve presented, the more mature ones generally focus on transportation infrastructure as a whole, and not specifically on pavements. And so that's also important to remember. Choosing one of these sustainability rating systems, again, which questions do you want to answer, which one fits best for your purposes. Now with that, this was the end of my slide. And I'd like to conclude by saying that We anticipate a pickup of the use of these different sustainability methods over time.